Hi, my name is Carter Clews. I am the Director of Communications for Judicial Watch. Welcome to Inside Judicial Watch. Today's program, let me give you a forewarning, is disturbing. We've talked about a lot of topics here. We've talked about Hillary Clinton's emails, the IRS, Lois Lerner. This particular program, this particular topic it could raise your ire, but even more than that, I believe that you're going to find it heartrending. And so let's get into it. We're honored to have with us Judicial Watch staff attorney Lauren Burke. Lauren, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Carter. I appreciate it.
You are the attorney who is heading up a case that is simply, I'm going to say, devastating. It's simply devastating because of what it entails personally for those involved. Take us back, if you will, to where this case started, because it started with a tragedy with which all of you are familiar, a terrorist attack on an Army base, Fort Hood in Keeling, Texas. Give us some background, if you would, Lauren.
Well, as you just mentioned, this is a case that is surrounding the terrorist attack that happened at Fort Hood November 5th, 2009. And we represent, and we have a case in federal court right now, the father of a soldier who is deceased, and he is seeking the Purple Heart for injuries that his son received during that terrorist attack. Taking it back just a little bit, Josh is the soldier, Josh Berry.
Josh Berry.
He had just recently returned from a year's deployment in Afghanistan, and he was stationed at Fort Hood in the Soldier Readiness Return Program. He had called his father actually November 4th, which is the day before the attacks. He said, "Everything's done. I have one more paper to sign in the morning, and I'm coming home." And he was delighted and happy. He had a new wife and a baby. And the next call to Mr. Berry, Howard Berry is his father and our client, came the following day that there had been a mass shooting at Fort Hood, and his son was injured, and he was in the hospital.
This was the mass shooting when a Islamic terrorist named Nidal Hasan, am I pronouncing that close enough at least?
Close enough.
Close enough.
Yes, I believe.
Decided to gun down his fellow soldiers. Killing how many?
I believe there were 30 killed and about 14 injured, or I may have that wrong.
13 killed, I think. And yeah,
Yes.
Exactly, precisely, including, by the way, a pregnant female soldier who, as she lay dying, begged this monster, my baby, don't kill my baby. This is the kind of person we're dealing with. This is the kind of story we're dealing with. And let me insert, if I may, because we have to have the record straight here. This was the attack that Barack Obama went on the air and refused to refer to as a terrorist attack. The Hassan shouted, Allah, how do you pronounce it? Allahu Akbar, praising Allah while he gunned down these soldiers. Barack Obama went on the air, refused to say it was a terrorist attack, and led his administration to simply call it what, Lauren?
It was an act of workplace violence. That's what it was deemed. And if I may, the Nidal Hasan was an American soldier. He was a psychiatrist stationed at Fort Hood, and so he was in full uniform when he opened fire. And that is part of the tragedy here. This is not just an act of workplace violence. It was a terrorist attack. He admitted at his trial, having been motivated by Al-Qaeda and several terrorist organizations. Unfortunately, it did take, well, let me correct that. As you said, the President and the Secretary of the Army, the Secretary of Defense, have never deemed this incident at Fort Hood an act of terrorism.
And that's to this day, right?
To this day.
That's to this day.
The Secretary of the Army.
President Trump, there's an oversight there.
And it is the Secretary of the Army that would have to designate the incident as a terrorist attack. It did take 4 years, a very aggressive letter writing campaign from victims and Americans to Congress, and it was Congress that actually, in the National Defense Authorization Act for 2015, imposed a separate provision that mandated that the victims at Fort Hood be considered for qualification for Purple Heart and other appropriate medals. However, unfortunately, that was a mandate made by Congress. And so, having just received a Purple Heart there, I believe there were about 47 that were awarded. They are not eligible for the benefits and services and resources that are provided to our military men and women having been injured, died, or left behind in the combat zone, because it is officially still designated as an act of workplace violence.
So what Barack Obama did with his designation and leading his administration to do that, and this is very key, you've explained this to me earlier, and it's really key to this story, and it deepens the tragedy, by refusing to recognize this terrorist attack by a terrorist who, by the way, the FBI had emails from this man consulting with Anwar al-Awlaki, the leading propagandist for al-Qaeda in this country, consulting with him about, if I kill my fellow soldiers, will I be a shaheed? Will I be a martyr? The FBI, by the way, Robert Mueller's FBI, had these documents, and Mueller ignored them. He defended ignoring them after the attack, and finally the New York Times did an article pointing out that the FBI, Robert Mueller's FBI, blew it. And what was the result? Because they refused to designate this as a terrorist attack, all these people who were wounded and killed, all those who were wounded, tell us about what they could not receive.
Well, up until, again, until Congress acted and mandated that those victims at Fort Hood be considered for qualification for the Purple Heart. That is all it did. Nidal Hasan, his trial, he was actually charged with only murder charges. There was no terrorist or any other terrorist-like charges. I do believe Barack Obama mentioned or referred to the incident in 2015 as a terrorist attack.
2015, finally.
And that is pretty much the extent of that kind of recognition. And under the Army regulations, it is the Army of the Secretary, and that has to designate an incident as an act of terrorism. And what I don't have full understanding, and you'll have to forgive me, the Army and military regulations. Sure. That can be a little bit deep, but a Purple Heart Award generally is not just a medal, but it's benefits. There are resources that are provided, services that victims and family members can use and utilize, which is only right, and that's what makes this a very tragic story and shameful on the U.S. military, that our client's son volunteered to defend his country. He deployed to Afghanistan, he returned home, and in defending against a terrorist, defending those in the room with him, and doing what he was trained to do, which was dive for cover and protect those around him when there were gunshots pelting at the door of the room that he was in. He injured himself. And again, for many, many years, nobody received recognition or medals. When when Congress did put forward that mandate in the NDAA, our client Howard, unfortunately, Josh, did not survive the mental anguish that he suffered.
Josh, in 2013.
In 2013, he did take his own life, and he did reveal to his father during the months following the Fort Hood shooting. There was 39 months. He returned home, but he was never the same. And what was so devastating to him, he had just returned again from Afghanistan, from combat, from losing friends and soldiers by his side. And when he did what he was trained to do at Fort Hood in the face of a terrorist attack, The aftermath of that was so devastating to him because it was swept under the rug, it was ignored, it was an act of workplace violence. He did not qualify for the resources that would generally be offered. The most difficult thing for him was trying to cope with or understand how his fellow soldier in the same uniform as he was in opened fire and murdered in mass shooting fellow soldiers and civilians, and then was put on a civil trial and allowed to grow his hair and had many, many rights that were granted to him as a civil criminal trial defendant gets. And those that were injured, Josh included, and his buddies, were forgotten.
They were forgotten, and there are certain treatments that are allotted to those who suffer this kind of a terrorist attack, if it is deemed a terrorist attack, right? I mean, psychiatric treatment, certain sort of counseling, all this to help in the trauma of it. And these people got none of it. Is that right? Because of what our government did.
Now, I can't speak to the specifics of what is offered or what the differences would be deemed terrorist attack or non-terrorist attack. But what happened here is a classic case of denial and political sweep-away, so that there maybe didn't need to be acknowledgement that there was a terrorist act on U.S. soil. And in any bureaucracy, which the military is, when you reach this level, then you receive these resources and this thing. How far it really goes, I can't speak to. We do have a psychologist. She is working with Howard, and she is a pit bull in her endeavor to really work for the victims of Fort Hood specifically. She was there, she survived, but even those that were or received a physical Purple Heart medal, they are being denied still the benefits that would come along with such an honor. They are being turned away from counseling, and for those that passed away, their families don't know where to go or what to do. And that's the situation here. Josh passed away, and when
Josh committed suicide in 2013.
In 2013.
Let me ask you this, because I know the answer, and it makes it all the more shocking. Of those who were victimized by this terrorist attack that the government still refuses to recognize, how many have committed suicide?
Well, that's the very unfortunate part, is that statistics on suicide following any kind of combat, I really couldn't quote to. But in this very specific incident, in the one shooting that happened at Fort Hood on U.S. soil by a U.S. military member of the armed forces, there have been 7 suicides. For those that were present or family members of those that lost Fort Hood victims, which is pretty astonishing.
It's pretty astonishing, and it's pretty heartrending.
And it is. So Howard came to us, Howard Berry, which is Josh's father, not knowing what to do.
Nobody would help him. Am I right? Nobody would help him.
Nobody would help him.
And all he wanted was his son to get the Purple Heart.
He wanted for his granddaughter, so that his granddaughter would have something of her father to hold on to. And when the NDAA was passed and the mandate went through, he went to the appropriate Board of Decorations, and it was denied. And then he went through the appeals process, which went then before the Army Board for Correction of Military Records. And it's a 3-member panel.
Right.
This is under the authorization of the Secretary of the Army.
Seeking the Purple Heart for his
Seeking
son.
an appeal to, correct, his military records. This 3-member panel was very thorough. It's actually quite impressive, their recommendation. I believe it reads about 8 to 10 pages, and it lists the numerous witness statements of Hasan's shooting at the door that Josh was in. It shows photos of shell casings. There are numerous medical reports and sergeants and higher up above Josh that clearly stated that he was a victim of attempted murder by Nidal Hasan. And they were very thorough in reviewing the regulations and the laws and what is permitted, and they found that Josh met the criteria to be awarded a Purple Heart. And it was a 2-to-1 decision, but that was their recommendation.
Right.
And then Mr. Berry received a 1-page cover letter to the board's recommendation and findings from the Office of the Secretary of the Army. There was, I believe, a total of 2 sentences that says, having reviewed the evidence and the board's recommendation, I find there is not enough evidence and the Purple Heart is denied. That has been where Howard was left.
This hero, twice over in Afghanistan, then again at Fort Hood, injured, defending his fellow soldiers, was denied the Purple Heart.
He wasn't denied the Purple Heart. I believe he was awarded the Purple Heart, and we sit here having then it been arbitrarily taken away with no presentment of why or basis. He meets the full criteria of the Army regulations. That was the finding of an investigative Army board and the recommendation. And so that's where we are here today, because
Thank
from
God
that
for
point,
Judicial Watch and you fighting this case. Where do we go from here?
Right now we have filed the litigation. We filed a lawsuit in D.C. federal court seeking the court to do a judicial review of the agency's arbitrary and capricious actions. We are asking them to review the final determination of the Office of the Secretary that went against the board's recommendation under the Administrative Procedures Act, and that essentially is that where Howard is left. I mean, that was his appeal, and he doesn't have any further administrative option, absent any new or newly presented evidence. But everything was presented to the board, and like I said, they recommended the award of the Purple Heart, and found that he met that criteria. And why, I don't know, but the Office of the Secretary turned it down.
And now, as I say, thank goodness, he has you fighting on his behalf. He has Judicial Watch behind him, and we know that's pretty tough customers to deal with. So that is the ray of hope. That is the silver lining. So
well, I hope something does happen, because this is wrong. It's tragic, and the Army should feel shameful for the way that they are treating not only Howard and his son, but all of the victims at Fort Hood.
Right.
Or any victim that deserves a Purple Heart. The bureaucratic process is unfortunate, and a single undersecretary in the Office of the Army should not be allowed to, with no explanation and in one statement, deny what is rightly owed.
Statement. Thank you. I've seen you at work in court, so I know that Josh Berry has a real good chance at justice, and I thank you, and I appreciate it. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for joining us on Inside Judicial Watch, and thank you for your support in cases like this to help us fight them, to fight the good fight, and hopefully win. Thanks for joining us.